In this section, we're going to take a closer look at the studies themselves, different types of studies, and different ways to collect your sample. There are different methods for conducting a study, and the method that's best really depends on the study and what type of data you're trying to collect. In an observational study, you're collecting information about the way things are without going in and purposefully trying to affect those results. For example, you might be going into a classroom and just observing the students and what's going on with them, or you might go out and conduct a survey about people's opinions, but you're not doing anything to actually try and change the results. There are three different types of observational studies. First, there's a cross-sectional study where you just collect all of your data at one time. You go into a classroom, you observe what's going on, and then you leave. Another type is a retrospective where you look back at old information, looking back through old records, things like that to collect your information. And then there's a longitudinal or a prospective study where you actually follow a group over time and see what happens as the years go by. An experiment is where you actually go in and do something to try and affect the results. So you might give people a new drug to see if it helps their symptoms, or go into a classroom and try a new type of teaching to see if it helps test scores go up. Sometimes when we're doing an experiment, we worry about something called the placebo effect, which is when someone thinks that they feel better just because they think that they're taking a drug and it's not because of the drug itself. So sometimes experiments will be set up as blind studies where the subject doesn't know whether they're getting the treatment or whether they're getting a placebo or a fake pill. Sometimes they'll even go so far as to make it a double-blind study where the researcher doesn't know either. They ask someone else to put people into two groups and to not tell them which group they're giving a real pill to and which group they're not, just in case the researcher might accidentally act differently toward one group than the other. Whether you're doing an observational study or an experiment, it is very important to make sure that you choose your sample in a good way so that you'll have a representative sample of the population. And so what I really want to focus on in this section is different ways to choose samples. When I go out and choose a sample for my study, I want to make sure not only that I interview enough people, but also that I've chosen them in a good way so that they'll represent lots of different types of people. And so I need to be sure that I don't interview all people from one group. If I'm interviewing students, I want to make sure they're not all English majors or just people who happen to be hanging out in the cafeteria. I want to somehow ensure that I have a good representative sample of all of the students. The best way to ensure a representative sample is to select your sample in a way that is random. If you don't do it randomly, then you may introduce some sort of bias that you aren't aware of. So we're going to talk about some different ways of collecting samples and whether or not they're random. There are several types of sampling methods that can be used, and we're going to talk about some of the most common ones and whether those are random or not. As I've mentioned before, the actual size of the sample we'll talk about later in the semester, but for now we're going to talk about how you choose the people in your sample or the subjects and whether that's a good method or not. Simple random sampling is what you think of when you just think of random, drawing names out of a hat, using a random number generator to choose subjects, anything where every member of the population has an equal chance of being chosen, but not only that, every group has an equal chance of being thrown together. So I have an equal chance of being paired up with any other person in the class. Random sampling is a little different because it does not require that everyone has an equal chance of being paired with everyone else. For example, if you and I are in a room and we both have our siblings with us and I'm pairing people up with their siblings, then I would not have any chance of being paired up with you. I would only be able to be paired up with my sister. So I would still have an equal chance of getting my group chosen, but I would not have the same chance of being paired up with you as I would with her. Simple random sampling is also random. It's a special case that's more restrictive. So random sampling in general just means that everyone has the same chance of being chosen. Simple random sampling means not only do I have an equal chance of being chosen, but I also have an equal chance of being paired up with every other person in the room. Systematic sampling is when you go through a list and pick every so many names on the list. So I might go through the phone book and pick every 10th person, for example. Or if I'm trying to check CDs for quality control on a manufacturing line, I might pick every 50th CD off the line, something like that. This is technically not random because the 9th person on the list doesn't have any chance of being chosen, only the 10th, the 20th, the 30th, so you don't all have an equal chance. So technically not random, though not necessarily a bad way of choosing your sample. Convenience sampling is when you find subjects who are easy to find. So I stand in front of my house and just see who walks by, or I go to the cafeteria and see who happens to be there, or I find people who work in my office. This is not random at all, and that makes it a really bad sample because it skews toward whatever particular group it is that you found. So if I find only people who work in my office, then those are the only types of people who are going to be in my sample. It's not random, and it won't be representative of any larger population that I'm trying to study. Stratified sampling is a common method to use where you break the population up into categories and then pick a random sample from each category. So this makes sure that you get a certain number of each group. So I might pick 20 men, 20 women, or I might separate the student body into freshmen and sophomores and pick a few of each, or I might separate cars by type and then make sure that I get a certain number of cars from each type, that kind of thing. Sometimes instead of picking a few from each group, it makes more sense to pick whole groups. So with cluster sampling, you divide the population into groups and then randomly pick a few of those groups to look at completely. So for example, I might divide the state into counties and then pick 5 counties and then survey everyone there. It's similar to stratified, so you have to be careful. With stratified, you pick a few from each group. With cluster, you pick whole groups, and which one is better really just depends on the situation. So now, just to give you a chance to practice telling the different types apart, I'm going to leave this slide up for 60 seconds and give you a chance to try figuring out which of those 6 types of sampling each of these is.